West Virginia, August 1982. The heat in the Blackwood Creek Hollow doesn't just rise, it settles. It sits on your chest like a wet wool blanket, heavy, suffocating, and utterly silent. In the high summer of '82, the air was different. It carried the metallic tang of coal dust from the distant mines of Logan County and the thick, cloying scent of damp earth that never truly dries in the shadows of the Appalachians. If you stood still enough on that Tuesday morning, the only thing you'd hear was the rhythmic, agonizing groan of the old-growth hemlocks, ancient giants leaning against one another, their bark scarred by generations of feuds and timber saws. There were no birds singing. Even the cicadas, usually a deafening chorus in the August heat, had gone quiet, as if the valley itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. At the edge of the timberline, where the jagged mountain slope finally surrenders to a patch of scorched yellow grass, stood the McNab farmhouse. It was a structure held together by little more than rusted nails and stubbornness. The white paint had long ago peeled away, leaving the wood gray and bone dry, like the ribs of a dead animal. And there, on the porch, lay the reason for the silence. Elias McNab wasn't supposed to be there. He was supposed to be at the mill, but instead he was sprawled across the warped floorboards, his body positioned in a way that defied the natural grace of a living man. His arms were thrown wide, palms up, as if asking the uncaring sky a final, desperate question. His face, it wasn't the face of a man who had gone peacefully. His features were twisted into a grotesque mask, a grimace of pure, unadulterated shock. His eyes remained wide, staring fixedly at the rusted tin roof above him, reflecting nothing but the void. The copper-sweet smell of fresh blood began to compete with the scent of pine needle and wood smoke. A single fly landed on his cheek, then another. The wind, cold, unnatural draft that seemed to descend straight from the dark peaks above, swept across the porch. It stirred the hem of his denim overalls and carried a low, mournful whistle through the cracks in the walls. It was a whisper of a sound, a hush from the mountain itself. In Blackwood Creek, secrets are buried deep in the mines and deeper in the woods. But on this morning, the secret had crawled out onto the porch for the whole world to see. This wasn't just a death. This was a declaration. Peace that had lasted, tenuous and fragile, for 20 years had just been shattered by a single lead slug and a century of resentment. The blood was still warm, soaking into the thirsty gray timber of the porch, and as the sun climbed higher, casting long skeletal shadows across the yard, one thing became chillingly clear. Elias McNab was only the first.
The Appalachian Mountains are a land of ancient shadows and long memories. To an outsider, these peaks in West Virginia look like a sanctuary of emerald green and mist. But for those born in the hollows, the mountains are a fortress and sometimes a prison. In the isolation of Blackwood Creek, time doesn't move in a straight line. It circles back on itself, feeding on stories passed down from fathers to sons over mason jars of moonshine and the cold steel of hunting rifles. For over 100 years, the names McNab and O'Connor were the two pillars of this valley. They were the law, the labor, and the lifeblood of the creek. Back in the late 1800s, they had survived the winter famines together. They had shared the same pews in the small clapboard church and buried their kin in the same rocky soil on the hillside. There were old yellowed photographs in local archives showing the patriarchs, Silas McNab and Jedediah O'Connor, standing shoulder to shoulder after a successful hunt, their bearded faces stern, their hands calloused from the same timber and the same coal. But in these mountains, Friendship is often just a thin veil over the hunger for land. The geography of Blackwood Creek was a map of unspoken tension. The McNabs owned the lower valley, where the soil was just rich enough for a few rows of corn and the grazing of lean cattle. The O'Connors held the ridges, the high ground, where the timber was thickest and the ancient oaks reached for the clouds. For decades, a fragile truce was maintained by a single jagged line of stones that marked the boundary of their empires. It was known as the timber line. Every child in the hollow knew the rules. You don't cross the timber line after dark, and you never, ever fell a tree that doesn't belong to your name. By 1982, the world outside was changing. The disco era was fading, Reagan was in the White House, and the price of high-grade hardwood was skyrocketing. To the McNabs and the O'Connors, who had lived for generations on the edge of poverty, the trees above them weren't just scenery anymore. Vonebula zolotom. The tension in the air was thick, like the sulfurous fog that rolled off the river. Old grievances, once buried under years of shared Sunday dinners, began to resurface. It started with small things. A fence post moved 6 inches to the west. A stray cow from the McNab farm found dead in an O'Connor ravine. A look held too long at the general store. The blood feud wasn't born from a single act. It was a slow rot. It was the sound of a chainsaw starting up on a foggy morning where it shouldn't be. It was the feeling of being watched from the tree line by eyes that no longer recognized you as a neighbor. The bond of blood that had once united these families was being replaced by a darker, colder kind of brotherhood, the brotherhood of the feud. And as the summer of '82 reached its sweltering peak, the valley felt like a powder keg waiting for a match. The people of Blackwood Creek knew that when the explosion finally came, it wouldn't be the law that settled it. It would be the mountains. And the mountains only accept one kind of payment for stolen land. The kind that runs red down the creek.
Before the first shot echoed through the hollow, before the name Blackwood Creek became a headline on the evening news, there was a quiet sort of beauty here. To understand the tragedy, you have to understand what was lost. You have to see the world as it was on those late July mornings in 1982, a world of simple rituals and weathered hands. The day would start early, long before the sun managed to climb over the jagged limestone cliffs of the Appalachians. You'd hear the screen door slapping shut, a sharp wooden crack that signaled the start of the day's labor. It was a sound that echoed from the McNab porch to the O'Connor cabin, a synchronized heartbeat of 2 families bound by the same rhythm of survival. In the kitchens, the air would be thick with the smell of percolating coffee and frying fat. The women, mothers like Martha McNab and Sarah O'Connor, would stand at their stoves, their faces illuminated by the soft golden glow of kerosene lamps. They shared recipes over the garden fences. They had delivered each other's children in those very bedrooms. There was a time when a McNab child would scrape their knee, and an O'Connor mother would be the first to wash away the dirt. Down in the yard, the dust would rise in soft golden clouds as the children played. They didn't know about property lines or timber rights. To them, the woods were a playground of endless mystery. They hunted for crawdads in the cold, clear water of the creek, their laughter ringing out through the trees. They were children of the mountain, shared by the community, unaware that the very ground they played on was becoming a battlefield. The men would gather by the old Ford trucks, leaning against the rusted fenders with their sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms stained with coal dust and grease. They talked about the weather, the dwindling price of tobacco, and the repairs needed on the old mill. There was a grim, silent respect between them. They were men of few words, their lives etched into their skin like the rings of an ancient oak. You could see the harmony in the small things. A borrowed tool returned with a nod, a bushel of apples left on a porch, a shared silence as they watched the mist burn off the ridges. It was a life of hard work and humble rewards, anchored by the belief that neighbor looked out for neighbor,
Because out here, in the deep isolation of the hills, that was the only law that mattered. But even then, the shadows were lengthening. The peace was like a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark lake. If you looked closely, you could see the cracks. You'd see it in the way a conversation would abruptly stop when a certain name was mentioned. You'd feel it in the heavy, expectant stillness of the afternoon heat. The people of Blackwood Creek were living on borrowed time, holding on to a way of life that was already beginning to slip through their fingers. They were holding on to the good old days, even as the rot was setting in. They didn't know that this was the last summer they would ever spend as friends. They didn't know that the very tools they used to build their lives, the axes, the knives, the hunting rifles, would soon be turned against the people they called brothers. The wind through the hemlocks was changing. It no longer carried the scent of wildflowers and rain. It was beginning to carry the scent of the coming storm.
The arrival of the serpent in the garden didn't come with a hiss, but with the roar of a high-displacement engine and the crunch of gravel under heavy tires. It was mid-August when the black Ford F-100, polished to a mirror finish that looked alien against the dull gray dust of Blackwood Creek, pulled up to the general store. Out stepped a man who looked like he had never spent a day under the canopy of a real forest. His name was Miller, an agent for the Interstate Timber Corporation, and he wore a suit that cost more than most families in the Hollow made in a year. In his hand, he carried a leather briefcase. Inside it were the seeds of the massacre. He didn't see the mountains as a home or a legacy. He saw them as a spreadsheet. He saw the ancient stands of white oak and black walnut as board feet and profit margins. And he knew exactly where the most valuable timber stood, right on the disputed timber line between the McNab and O'Connor properties. Miller began to move through the valley like a plague. He didn't talk to the families together, he cornered them individually. He sat on the McNab porch, drinking their sweet tea while pointing toward the ridges. "That's a fortune just rotting away up there, Elias," he would say, his voice smooth as riverstone. "The O'Connors claim it's theirs, but my surveyors, well, they see it differently. You sign these rights over to us, and you'll never have to worry about a failing crop again." Then he would drive up to the O'Connor ridge and tell the same lie, polished with a different shine. He whispered about how the McNabs were planning to steal the heritage of the high ground, how they were already talking to lawyers in the city. He played on their pride, their poverty, and the dormant seeds of suspicion that had stayed quiet for 20 years. The atmosphere in the hollow changed instantly. The shared silence of the mornings was replaced by a new, sharp tension. Men who used to wave at each other from their trucks now gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, staring straight ahead. The air felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike, heavy with the static of unspoken accusations. Miller had offered them a choice, wealth or neighborly peace. But in a place where the winter wind cuts through the walls and the cupboards are often bare, wealth looks a lot like survival. He turned the trees into weapons. He turned the land into a prize. The logging company's maps were drawn in ink, but the lines they created would soon be redrawn in blood. By the time Miller left the valley that week, he had achieved his goal. He had cracked the foundation of Blackwood Creek. The families were no longer looking at the forest for its beauty. They were looking at it as something that had to be defended at any cost. The first chainsaw hadn't even been fueled yet, but the first cut had already been made, deep into the heart of the community.
If the mountains were the altar of this tragedy, then the rusty nail was its confession booth. It was a squat, windowless building made of cinder blocks and wood, tucked away in a corner of the valley where the sun rarely reached. Inside, the air was a permanent swirl of stale tobacco smoke, the tang of cheap bourbon, and the sour scent of unwashed work clothes. It was the only place for miles where a man could drown the dust of the mines. But on this night in late August, the alcohol wasn't dulling the senses. It was sharpening the blades. The lighting was a sickly, dim yellow, hummed out by buzzing neon beer signs
that flickered like dying stars. In the center of the room sat the long table, a massive slab of oak that had seen decades of card games and laughter. But tonight, there was a literal line drawn in the condensation of the beer bottles. On the left sat the McNabs, Elias with his jaw set like granite, and his brothers, their eyes hooded and dark. On the right, the O'Connors. Old man Silas O'Connor sat at the head, his garneled hands wrapped around a glass, his knuckles white. The space between them was only a few feet of air, but it felt like a canyon that no one could cross. The silence in the bar was unnatural. The jukebox was unplugged. The only sound was the clicking of a ceiling fan that did nothing but move the heat around. It started with a whisper, a comment about city lawyers and mountain thieves that drifted across the table like a spark into dry tinder. Elias McNab leaned forward, his voice a low growl that vibrated in the floorboards. That timber has been ours since the Grand of '89, Silas. You know it, and the trees know it. You let that logging truck onto the ridge, and you're stepping on my father's grave. Silas didn't blink. He just stared through the amber liquid in his glass. A grave is just dirt, Elias, but that ridge is O'Connor blood. My granddaddy bled into that soil while yours was still hiding in the lowlands. If a truck rolls, it's because the land called for it. And if you stand in the way, well, the mountain has a way of moving obstacles. Suddenly, the chair legs scraped against the floor like a scream. Men stood up, shoulders squared, fingers twitched near pockets and belt loops. You could smell the sudden spike of adrenaline, a sharp metallic scent that cut through the smoke. The bartender, a man who had seen 1,000 fights, didn't even try to break it up. He just stepped back and reached for the shotgun kept under the bindboard, knowing that this wasn't a barroom brawl. This was the opening act of a war. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. A McNab hand balled into a fist. An O'Connor hand reached for a heavy glass ashtray. The hatred in the room was so thick you could feel it on your skin, oily and cold. They weren't neighbors anymore. They weren't even men. They were the personification of a century-old hunger, fueled by a stranger's promises and a sudden desperate greed. No blood was spilled that night at the Rusty Nail, but the peace was dead before the first man walked out the door. As the McNabs retreated into the night and the O'Connors stayed to finish their bitter drinks, everyone in that room knew the same thing. The talking was over. From here on out, the only thing that would speak for either family was the crack of wood and the thunder of gunpowder. The heavy wooden door swung shut, and for the first time in 100 years, the hollow felt truly, terrifyingly empty.
In a world defined by the hardness of men, by the grit of the mines, the sharpness of the axe, and the unyielding cold of property lines, Ellie McNab was an anomaly. At 19, she possessed the same striking auburn hair that had belonged to her great-grandmother, a shade of autumn leaves that seemed to catch fire just before they finally withered and fell. While the men gathered in smoke-filled taverns to carve up the map of the hollow, Ellie sought sanctuary by the river, where the waters of Blackwood Creek tumbled over ancient moss-covered stones, washing the mountain silence down into the valley. On this evening, as the sky above the gorge bruised into shades of deep violet and slate gray, she sat upon a weathered log, clutching a handful of wilting wildflowers. The water, usually as clear as a mountain spring, seemed different today. It looked leaden, thick, and secretive. Ellie stared at her reflection in a still pool and found she didn't recognize her own face. In her eyes, usually bright with the curiosity of youth, there sat a heavy, ancient weariness that no 19-year-old should carry. She was the only one who didn't see the dollar signs or the board feet of timber. She saw the cracked spider webbing through the very foundation of their lives.
She saw it in the way her father, Elias, sat by the window every night, obsessively cleaning a rifle he had owned for 20 years, but had never used for anything but deer. She heard it in the way her mother wept into her pillow at night, trying to drown out the sounds of a forest that had suddenly become a labyrinth of enemies. To Ellie, these woods had always been a cathedral of secrets. Now, they were a gallery of ambushes. She remembered, with a pang of literal physical pain, how just last summer, Tommy O'Connor, a boy from the wrong side of the ridge, would bring her jars of wild sourwood honey. They used to meet at the high meadow where the trees interlaced their canopies, indifferent to whose land the roots belonged to. Now, that meadow was a no-man's land, mined with hatred and suspicion. She knew Tommy carried a weapon now, too. She could feel it in the air, the cold, invisible edge of steel that had sliced their connection in two. Ellie looked up toward the peaks, where the sun was dipping below the horizon. The forest stood like a black wall, advancing slowly toward the valley floor. She felt the atmosphere grow tense, a physical weight on her chest, as if she were already hearing the echoes of the shots that would change everything. It wasn't just a premonition. It was the realization that the world she loved was already dead. It just hadn't stopped moving yet. With a sigh that was lost to the wind, she tossed the flowers into the water. They swirled in the dark eddies, spinning helplessly before being pulled under by the roots of an old willow. Ellie knew then that the thing that had crawled into Blackwood Creek wouldn't be satisfied with just the trees. It had come for their souls. It had come to claim their history and leave nothing behind but the bitter, metallic taste of ash and the hollow echo of a name no one would dare speak again. She stood up, shivering as the mountain chill finally descended. In that fading light, she looked less like a girl and more like a ghost of the life they once shared. She turned her back on the river and walked toward the farmhouse, where the shadows were already waiting on the porch, ready to swallow the last light of the summer.
High above the valley floor, where the air is thinner and the wind carries the scent of ancient resin, sat the O'Connor cabin. It was a fortress of notched logs and mud chinking, clinging to the spine of the ridge like a hawk's nest. Here, the shadows didn't just fall, they lived. And on the porch, sitting in a rocker that hadn't moved in 40 years, was Silas O'Connor, the patriarch of the high ground. Silas didn't look like a man anymore. He looked like a part of the landscape, a knot of old cedar that had survived a century of lightning strikes. His skin was a map of deep-etched wrinkles, paths carved by 80 years of Appalachian winters and the unrelenting sun of the timberlines. His eyes, clouded by cataracts, but sharpened by a lifetime of suspicion, were fixed on the road below. They were the eyes of a sentinel, watching for the first sign of a betrayal he had been expecting since the day he was born. Resting across his lap was an old double-barrel shotgun. Its walnut stock was worn smooth by the friction of his palms, and the bluing on the barrels had long ago faded to a dull, honest gray.
The night didn't come with the usual cool relief of the mountains. It came with a suffocating, unnatural heat. It was 2 a.m. when the sky over the timberline didn't turn to the gray of dawn, but to a sickening, bruised orange. The air, which had been stagnant and heavy for weeks, was suddenly whipped into a frenzy by a hot wind that smelled of resin, charred bone, and ancient dying wood. It started at the border, a single splash of kerosene onto the dry needles of a towering white pine, a match struck by a hand trembling with either fear or fury. Within minutes, the spark had become a beast. In the drought-stricken August of '82, the forest wasn't just wood, it was tinder, a century's worth of fallen leaves and dry bark waiting for an excuse to scream. The sound was what the survivors would remember most. It wasn't the crackle of a campfire, it was the roar of a jet engine, a deep rhythmic thrum that shook the very bedrock of the Appalachians. The fire didn't crawl, it leaped. It crowned in the hemlocks, jumping from peak to peak like a predatory animal, turning the majestic canopy into a wall of living, breathing hell. Down in the hollow, the McNabs were jolted awake by the orange glow reflecting off their bedroom windows. Elias ran to the porch, his boots crunching on the dry grass that was already being showered with glowing embers. He looked up at the ridge, the O'Connor Ridge, and saw his inheritance, his future, and the very lungs of the valley being consumed by a fire that looked too deliberate to be an accident. "They did it!" Caleb McNab screamed, pointing a sustained finger at the burning horizon. "The O'Connors burned the line. They'd rather see it all turn to ash than let a McNab touch a single branch." The accusation was a wildfire of its own. It didn't matter that the wind was blowing toward the O'Connor cabins. It didn't matter that Silas O'Connor was at that very moment standing in his yard, his face illuminated by the destruction of his own legacy, tears of rage carving tracks through the soot on his cheeks. In the heat of that night, logic was the first thing to burn. The fire created its own weather, a localized hurricane of embers and smoke that blinded the eyes and choked the throat. Through the haze, the two families began to move. They weren't running for shovels or buckets, they were running for their gun cabinets. The fire had stripped away the last veneer of civilization, leaving only the raw, blackened bones of a blood feud. As the ancient oaks exploded under the pressure of their own boiling sap, sounding like a battery of heavy artillery, the first shadow moved across the timberline. The fire had provided the cover, the motive, and the madness. The valley was no longer a home, it was a furnace, and the only way to cool the flames was with a sacrifice that the mountains had been demanding for 100 years. The smoke thickened, turning the world into a claustrophobic nightmare of orange and black. And there, in the scorching heart of the woods, the first hammer was cocked. The spark of war hadn't just burned the trees, it had finally ignited the blood.
The fire had turned the sky into a bruised canopy of smoke, but on the forest floor, the darkness was absolute, save for the flickering, hellish light filtering through the trees. The air was a thick soup of ash and pine tar, making every breath a struggle. It was here, in the serrated shadows of the Devil's Elbow, a sharp, treacherous bend in the logging trail, that the first trap was sprung. Young Tommy O'Connor was moving fast, his chest heaving. He wasn't looking for a fight, he was looking for his stray hound, a blue tick that had bolted when the first oaks began to crown in flames. He carried his rifle slung over his shoulder, a weight he had grown used to, but never expected to use against a man he'd shared bread with. The smoke stung his eyes, blurring the world into a series of terrifying, shifting shapes. He didn't hear the click of the safety. The roar of the fire on the ridge acted as a perfect shroud for the movements of the men in the brush. Suddenly, the shadows to his left breathed. "You lost, O'Connor." The voice belonged to Jed McNab, Elias's youngest brother. It was a voice stripped of all neighborly warmth, replaced by a crystalline, jagged hatred. Tommy froze, his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached for his sling, but the movement was too slow, hampered by the dense laurel thickets. Before his fingers could even touch the cold steel of his barrel, a heavy shape stepped out from behind a blackened hemlock. Then another. 3 McNabs emerged like phantoms from the haze. Their faces were smeared with soot and sweat, making them look less like men and more like the vengeful spirits of the mountain itself. The firelight glinted off the brass of their shell casings. There was no trial. There was no plea for mercy. In the distorted logic of the feud, Tommy wasn't a boy who had shared honey with Ellie. He was a limb of the tree that had to be pruned. The first shot didn't sound like a rifle. It sounded like the mountain itself cracking open. Tommy was thrown backward into the dirt, the impact of the lead slug knocking the breath from his lungs. The world tilted. He looked up through the swirling embers and saw the silhouettes of his former friends standing over him. Their eyes were vacant, possessed by a madness that had been brewing for generations. "This is for the timber," Jed hissed, his face inches from Tommy's. "And this is for the line." The woods erupted in a frantic, disorganized symphony of violence. Shouts were swallowed by the wind. The flash of muzzles illuminated the trees for a split second, revealing a chaotic dance of silhouettes. Tommy tried to crawl, his fingers digging into the scorched earth, but the shadows were everywhere. The ambush was over in seconds, but the silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire.
The McNabs vanished back into the smoke as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind a void that the fire could never fill. On the forest floor, the blood ran dark and steaming, mixing with the ash of trees that had stood for 200 years. The peace of Blackwood Creek hadn't just been broken, it had been executed, and as the fire raged on toward the O'Connor Ridge, the mountain took its first payment in full. The war was no longer about land or logs. It was about the cold, hard weight of a body in the dirt.
In the early morning light, the smoke from the ridge didn't lift. It crawled down into the valley, hugging the surface of Blackwood Creek like a burial shroud. The fire above had begun to burn itself out, leaving the mountain a skeletal landscape of black and gray. But the true devastation was only now coming to the surface. The creek had always been the lifeblood of the hollow. It was where the families baptized their infants, where they cooled their weary feet after a day in the mines, and where the mountain filtered its secrets into the valley floor. But today, the water was different. It carried a heavy, metallic tang, and the surface was filmed with a layer of fine white ash that looked like fallen snow in the middle of a sweltering August. It was Ellie McNab who found him. She had gone to the riverbank, not to find peace, but because the house felt too much like a tomb. She stood among the reeds, the cold water lapping at her boots, when she saw a shape drifting slowly around the bend near the old mill. It moved with a sickening, effortless grace, bobbing gently in the slow current. At first, it looked like a fallen log, or perhaps a bundle of discarded clothing. But as it drew closer, caught in an eddy of black water, the reality crashed down on her like a mountain slide. It was Tommy O'Connor. His body was pale, almost luminous against the dark stones of the riverbed. His auburn hair, the same shade as Ellie's, clouded around his head like a halo of rust. The river, which had once been their secret meeting place, had become his final resting place. The water washed over his open eyes, staring blankly at the gray sky, indifferent to the love or the hate that had put him there. There was no scream. The grief was too fast for a sound so small. Ellie simply sank to her knees in the mud, her hands reaching out toward the water, but never touching it. The current pulled Tommy's body further downstream, toward the lower valley, as if the mountain itself were trying to deliver a message to the McNabs at the bottom of the hill. This was the true cost of the timberline. It wasn't measured in board feet or banknotes. It was measured in the weight of a young man who would never see the spring, drifting toward a family who would never find peace. The water of Blackwood Creek, once pure and life-giving, was now tainted by the salt of tears and the copper of blood. The river flowed on, oblivious to the centuries of feuding. It carried the boy past the charred remains of the forest, past the silent farmhouses, and out toward the wide, uncaring world. But for the people of the Hollow, the river had become a boundary that could never be crossed again. The bridge between the families hadn't just been burned, it had been drowned. As the sun struggled to pierce through the thick ashen haze, the silence over the water was absolute. Even the wind had died down. There was only the sound of the creek, a low, mournful gurgle that sounded like 1,000 voices whispering the names of the dead.
The violence had left the valley breathless, but the silence that followed was far more terrifying. In Blackwood Creek, the morning of the burials didn't bring the usual mountain mist. It brought a cold, gray light that seemed to drain the color from the world. 2 hillsides, 2 families, and 1 shared grave of a community. Outside the small whitewashed Baptist church, a building that had once seen McNabs and O'Connor sit in the same pews, the air was thick with the scent of damp wool and lilies. But today, the church door remained locked. The preacher had fled the valley 2 days prior, claiming the devil had taken up permanent residence in the hollow. Instead, the families gathered in their own yards, separated by a mile of charred forest and an eternity of resentment. The women were the ones who bore the weight of the silence. They stood like statues carved from the mountain granite, dressed in black dresses that had been folded in cedar chests for years, waiting for a day like this. Martha McNab stood by a simple pine casket, her hands trembling as she smoothed the fabric over her son's chest. Her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, the fire of anger having burned out, leaving only the cold ash of a mother's loss. Across the ridge, the O'Connor women were ghosts in the haze. There were no hymns sung that day. There were no comforting words whispered over fences. The only sound was the rhythmic, metallic thud of shovels hitting the rocky soil, a sound that echoed across the gorge like a heartbeat. Every strike of the spade was a reminder that the land they had fought over was finally taking back what it was owed. The men stood apart, their hats pulled low, their faces masks of stoic agony. They didn't look at each other. They couldn't. To catch the eye of a neighbor was to see a reflection of their own guilt. The timber rights, the logging contracts, the timber line, it all seemed like a fever dream now. Standing over the fresh earth, the wealth they had been promised felt as heavy and useless as the stones they were shoveling. In Blackwood Creek, grief wasn't a private affair, it was a contagion. It seeped into the wells and poisoned the gardens. The community that had survived the Great Depression and the collapse of the mines was finally being undone by its own blood. As the first handfuls of dirt fell onto the wooden lids, sounding like distant thunder, the realization began to dawn on them. They weren't just burying their sons, they were burying their history. The valley had become a place of widows and empty chairs. The children, once loud and vibrant, now sat in the shadows of the porches, watching their parents with wide, fearful eyes. They had learned the most bitter lesson of the Appalachians, that out here, the mountains don't care about your names or your fences. They only care about the harvest. And this year, the harvest was human. The sun began to sink behind the blackened peaks, casting long, skeletal shadows over the new mounds of earth. The funeral was over, but the mourning had only just begun. In the growing dark, the two families retreated into their homes, locking their doors against a world that had become a graveyard.
Sheriff Miller, no relation to the timber agent who had poisoned the well of this community, stood by the hood of his dusty 1979 Chevrolet Nova, the blue and red lights of his light bar turned off. There was no point in flashing them now. The emergency was over. The catastrophe had already settled into the soil. He looked out over the valley from high overlook, his hand resting habitually but wearily on the belt of his service revolver. He was a man of the law in a place where the law was often nothing more than a suggestion whispered against the roar of the wind. He had grown up with the McNabs and the O'Connors. He had played baseball with Elias and shared a hunting blind with Silas. He knew the genealogies of these families better than his own, and that was exactly why he knew his handcuffs and his badges were useless here. In the Appalachians, justice isn't found in a courtroom in the county seat. It's a primitive thing, settled in the dark, governed by the ancient code of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a life for a life. The sheriff's face was a map of failure. The deep lines around his mouth weren't just from age. They were from years of trying to mediate disputes over stray cattle and diverted streams, trying to hold back the tide of a century-old resentment with nothing but a tin star and a weary voice. He had seen the logging trucks leaving the valley that morning, Miller, the agent, nowhere to be found, the corporation having pulled out the moment the first body was reported. They had left the fire they started for the locals to put out. "They won't talk," his deputy whispered, leaning against the passenger door. "I went to the O'Connors. Silas just sat there on his porch with that shotgun, didn't even look at me. Went to the McNabs. Elias told me to get off his land before the crows got a fresh meal." The sheriff nodded slowly, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dry dirt. "They won't talk, because there's nothing left to say that the lead hasn't already whispered. To them, I'm not the law. I'm an outsider. They've closed the circle, deputy. When a feud goes this deep, they don't want a judge. They want a witness." He looked down at the flickering lanterns in the hollow. He could feel the eyes of the mountain watching him, the same eyes that had watched the blood spill into the creek and the timber turn to ash.
He felt the crushing weight of his own impotence. He could arrest a man for theft or for speeding, but how do you arrest a whole mountain for its hatred? How do you put a century of pride behind bars? He reached into his car and turned the key. The engine groaned, a tired metal sound that seemed to protest the very air of Blackwood Creek. As he drove slowly down the winding road, his headlights cutting through the lingering haze of smoke, he didn't feel like a peace officer. He felt like a coroner. The law had come to Blackwood Creek, but it had arrived 100 years too late. As the taillights of his Chevy disappeared around the bend, the darkness reclaimed the road, and the valley returned to the only authority it ever truly recognized, the cold, silent judgment of the peaks.
The funerals were over, but the ground was still hungry. In the days following the burials, Blackwood Creek transformed into a landscape of ghosts. The timberline was no longer a border of property. It was a front line. The families didn't wait for the sheriff to return. They didn't want his questions or his paperwork. They wanted the man who had pulled the trigger in the smoke. They wanted the face behind the flash. Groups of men from both sides, brothers, cousins, and desperate fathers, began to comb through the blackened skeletal remains of the forest. They moved in silence, their overalls stained with soot, their eyes narrowed against the glare of the sun. They carried their rifles not at the shoulder, but at the low ready, fingers tracing the curves of their triggers with a terrifying rhythmic obsession. They weren't looking for timber anymore. They were looking for a sign, a spent casing, a blood-stained leaf, a footprint in the ash. Every snapping twig was a reason to shoulder a weapon. Every rustle of a squirrel in the laurel was a potential ambush. The air was thick with a new kind of poison. It wasn't the smoke or the heat. It was the absolute crystalline certainty that the man standing across the ridge was no longer a neighbor, but a target. They moved through the shadows of the burnt hemlocks like wolves, their humanity stripped away by the heat of the fire and the coldness of the grave. In the hollow, the search wasn't for justice. It was for a name to put on the next bullet.
As August bled into September, the sky over Blackwood Creek took on a hue that no one in the valley had ever seen before. The lingering smoke from the ridge fires, mixed with a rare atmospheric dust, turned the sunsets into a violent, bruised masterpiece of crimson and deep orange. The locals called it the blood sky. Standing on the porches of their silent houses, the McNabs and the O'Connors would watch the sun dip behind the jagged peaks. The light didn't feel warm. It felt like a stain. It reflected off the water of the creek, turning the ripples into a flow of liquid fire, a constant reminder of the young men who had been claimed by the current. It was as if the mountain itself were bleeding. The old women whispered that the land was cursed, that the blood of the innocent and the guilty had mixed so thoroughly in the soil that the trees would grow back twisted, their leaves forever stained with the color of the feud. They said the wind no longer whistled through the gorge. It moaned the names of the dead. The beauty of the Appalachians had turned predatory. The sunset wasn't a promise of rest. It was a warning that the darkness was coming, and with it, the memories that no one could outrun. The blood sky hung over them like a divine judgment, a silent witness to a tragedy that had no heroes, only survivors who wished they had stayed in the fire.
Years have passed since the summer of '82. But if you drive through the West Virginia back roads and find your way to the mouth of Blackwood Creek, you'll find that the mountain has a way of erasing what it doesn't want to remember. The McNab farmhouse is a skeleton now. The roof has caved in, and the porch where Elias once lay has been reclaimed by the blackberry briars and the creeping ivy. The O'Connor cabin on the ridge is nothing more than a pile of mossy stones, the timber having rotted back into the earth from which it grew. No logging trucks ever came back. The corporation moved on to easier harvests, leaving behind a valley that was too haunted to be profitable. The timberline is gone. The forest has grown back, but it's different now. Thicker, darker,
and strangely quiet. There are no McNabs left in the hollow. There are no O'Connors on the ridge. The feud didn't end with a treaty. It ended with an exit. Those who didn't die moved away, carrying the weight of the valley in their hearts like a piece of lead that never quite settles. The only thing that remains is the creek. It still flows over the dark stones, cold and indifferent. It doesn't care about property rights. It doesn't care about timber. It only carries the water from the high peaks down to the sea. And if you stand on the bank when the wind is just right, you might hear a sound. It isn't a gunshot, and it isn't a scream. It's just the sound of the leaves, a soft, persistent whispering of names that have been forgotten by the world, but are forever etched into the silence of the ash. Blackwood Creek is empty now. The mountain has finally found its peace, but it's the peace of the graveyard, where the only thing that grows is the memory of what happens when a man loves his land more than his brother.